So I just want to thank you guys for all attending tonight, and I'm so thrilled to have you all here on this Thursday evening and introduce Charles Bearden. He has been a physician's assistant in organ procurement and graduated from one of the first classes of Emory University Medical Center, and is pleased to join us. I was absolutely honored to connect with him through a mutual contact and friend in the transplant space. Please welcome tonight. And he's going to answer some questions for us, share his incredible story of 50 years in the space. He has performed over 3,000 organ procurements. Please welcome tonight with me. And he's going to share his story and answer any questions for us, the importance on patient voice and advocacy in transplantation. Charles, please take it away.
Thank you, Jen. That was very kind. And I've been looking forward to this. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I tend to ramble on, so Jen said she'd get the hook on me if I talk too long. But I'd like to do this if I could. I'd like to talk to you mostly about patient advocacy and the things that patient advocates can do, because boy, that's
recording in progress.
It's really amazing things that are going on. Can you still, everybody hearing me okay?
Yes.
Yes,
And maybe you want to mute everyone?
Yep, that's what I'm doing right now. Yeah.
Awesome.
So, and what I'd like to do is to start off with a story at the beginning and a story at the end. Some stories that have inspired me over the course of my career that I think you will find interesting and hopefully inspiring. And then in the middle, I'd like to talk to you about patient advocacy and some of the things that have happened lately that are new and that present opportunities that I haven't seen in a long time. But first, just a couple of the stories. One is a heart recipient. Friend of mine, actually met him 28 years ago when he had his heart transplant. And I met him because I took care of his donor, who he was up in Detroit, Michigan, had been on a heart transplant waiting list for, 5 years. Big, tall lumberjack guy, blood type O, it was really going to have to wait. So he'd been waiting a long time. And he had been sick with heart disease and multiple cabbages and things for a long time before that. But anyway, I met him when he finally got a heart transplant, and we became friends. And he lives in Michigan. His name is Chet Zuber. Here's our recent picture of us hanging out together in up at the Huron View Christmas tree and berry farm, which is his business in Michigan. And it's a gorgeous place. And so I have been up there to see him every couple of years, pretty regularly for the last 28 years. And we've become pretty close over time. And he's obviously, we've been visiting for 28 years. He's obviously done very well. So, but I met his donor first. There was no transplant coordinator available in Knoxville, Tennessee one weekend, and I worked for the same company but in Chattanooga, so I was cross covering, and I got a call about 1 o'clock. They had a young lady who had been in a car accident, been helicoptered in, wasn't going to survive her isolated head injury, and they needed me to come right away because she wasn't very stable, and they were concerned that she might not last long enough to be an organ donor. And she was young and healthy, so we knew that she could donate a lot of her organs. So I hopped up to Knoxville real quick and met this young lady named Patty. And turns out she was a student nurse. She was on vacation with her best boyfriend in the Smoky Mountains down from Michigan. And not sure of the circumstances, but they had a wreck up on the Blue Ridge Parkway and lost control of the car. And she had an isolated fatal head injury. So she was inoperable. We knew there was nothing that we could do. But like a lot of patients with severe brain injury like that, when I saw her blood pressure was very low and her heart rate was very fast, and she wasn't oxygenating very well, and her body temperature had fallen and her blood had gotten too acidotic, and she had all of the problems that a brain dead donor encounters as their brain is dying. Everything that it used to do for you, it stops doing. It stops maintaining your body temperature. It stops controlling your urine output. It doesn't control, you lose your ability to control your blood pressure, on and on and on. So it takes a fair amount of intervention, but I was able to do that during the course of the rest of that early morning hours. Patty stabilized, and she was in fact able to be an organ donor. So it turns out that a brand new coordinator who had been out to Phoenix that weekend came back, and so I was able to sort of turn the case over to her. I mean, I knew that we had already gotten word that the family wanted her to be a donor. They had been contacted on the phone, had been basically told not to come because they didn't think that she would last that long, but because we stabilized her, she did, and they came down from Michigan. And so I turned the case over to the brand new coordinator, and she proceeded from there. So it was there was some reasons that it was difficult, and it was hard for me to forget that case. A lot had to do with some interactions with her boyfriend when the police finally let him out of jail, and he showed up at 3 a.m. wanting to see her, and it was a very sad scene. Of course, he couldn't, but anyway, I got to leave the next day. But at any rate, as it turns out, this is Patty. And Patty's last name was Zuber. And the man that I was sitting next to has had her heart beating in his chest for 28 years. So I don't think I had ever encountered such a thing in my career, that, someone would lose a child and donate the heart and the liver and the kidneys and all of those things. But we realized right away when we understood that her dad was had been on the heart transplant waiting list a long time. In fact, she had said previously her father had been sick all of her life, and she knew he was waiting on a heart transplant. So she was aware of that, but didn't change the sad outcome of her accident. So Chet had some difficulty accepting doing it. He of course refused initially, which we weren't surprised, but we felt like we should give him some time, and we counseled the family because everybody was completely aware that if their blood types matched, that this would be an immunologically advantageous transplant, because basically he would have half of her DNA. So perhaps the reason that Patty's heart has never skipped a beat, he's never had a single rejection episode, and he's now 85, and I'm only 72. But anyway, we've been friends for a long time because I think he's still the only person that I've ever heard of who had a child who donated their heart to them. So things like that happen. All kinds of things happen in the donor world and the recipient world, and when someone gets 28 years of life, that's quite an accomplishment. So he and I have shared a lot over the years, and he's been an inspiration to me, and the story's been an inspiration to me because I knew how difficult it was. I knew how difficult it was for me to just take care of the young lady, much less have to be a parent. But I was sort of used to that because that came with the territory of being an organ recovery coordinator. I got up a lot of nights and went to a hospital and had to meet and interact with a grieving family of someone who had suddenly died, often violently and always tragically, and those kinds of things. So I was kind of used to that dynamic. But at any rate, I have been, and that was really what I had been. This was, that was in the early 90s or mid 90s, but I had been an organ transplant coordinator since 1978. I had been asked to start the kidney bank because we didn't do hearts and livers and lungs back in the 70s. We only did kidneys. So I got asked to start the organ bank in Atlanta by a classmate of mine from Emory who started the organ bank at Vanderbilt and at Nashville. So I said, oh yeah, I'd like to try that. So started the organ bank in Atlanta when we just did kidneys. And back then, in the early 70s, there weren't very many transplant surgeons, and there certainly weren't enough surgeons to do the kidney recoveries. And so it was sort of standard practice to hire physician's assistants with surgical background and train them to do these en bloc nephrectomies, where they could remove the kidneys from the donor so that they could be preserved and packaged and allocated and hopefully transplanted. And so I had the sort of the good fortune to have the right kind of surgical background to be able to do that. And then they sent me to Vanderbilt for a while and taught me how to do these nephrectomies. So I had that sort of advantage when I first started working in the kidney bank in Atlanta, and did a lot of nephrectomies, and came back to Atlanta and did a lot of nephrectomies, and taught a lot of surgeons in the community and otherwise to how to do it. So because I didn't want to keep doing it forever, but that was a really interesting perspective to do the surgery on the donors. It taught me a lot. And of course, I was getting consent from their families and taking care of them and evaluating them and managing them and getting them ready to go and all those kinds of things. So I started back in the days when transplant coordinators did everything, sort of from start to finish. So which was good, but that's a time gone by. The job has sort of been fragmented up into smaller pieces of pie these days. But the thing that benefited me the most was the ability to take care of those families, because you just couldn't imagine being able to step into a situation like that and do more good than you might be able to do if you could give those families something that was comforting and that would be something that they would feel good about in the future and they could hang on to. So I considered that a privilege. And so that's been a part of my career. I have advocated for donors and their families, and I have advocated for recipients and their families. And I have advocated for the third party, which are frontline organ recovery coordinators, because they connect the two people, okay? And I didn't have to worry about the transplant centers. They were doing great. I mean, I got a chance to work with a lot of them in the early days. I mean, a lot of the heart, liver, lung surgeons, because I had access to the donors in Atlanta. Since I did the nephrectomies before there was a UNOS, we basically made the decisions about where the organs were going to go. And because it was all brand new in 82, when cyclosporin came out, suddenly every big center in the country wanted to start doing heart transplants and liver transplants and lung transplants, because that drug was going to overcome a lot of the barriers that had prevented those things and had, kept the results poor, just like we struggled with kidney results for a long time. So when cyclosporin hit, and boy, it changed everything. And it was a period of accelerated change. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because I think we're in another period of accelerated change right now. But back then we had to move fast. And so all the transplant coordinators around the country organized and designed and implemented the very first extrarenal, or organs other than kidneys, organ sharing network in the United States. CEOF existed for kidney sharing. Remember, UNOS wasn't there yet. And so we developed that system. And I got to had the privilege and opportunity to work with a lot of transplant surgeons on some of the first cases that were done. A lot of the heart and lung cases back at the time, we didn't know how long we could preserve the organs outside the body. And so the requirements for some of those first transplants were that you had to have the donor in an adjacent operating room to the recipient. And of course, those recipients weren't in Atlanta, and you had to go to them, and your donor had to go to them. So I got involved in not only consenting for the donation, but getting families to agree to let me take their loved one out of the hospital, to the airport, and put them in a private plane and fly them to Toronto or Pittsburgh or California or those kinds of things, so that they could be next to the recipient for some of the first lung transplants. The first lung transplants were done in Toronto and in Canada. First successful ones were done up there. So, and so I got to do some of those first lung transplants and some of the first heart lung transplants. The first one in Canada, the first ones where we flew donors into Pittsburgh. And had an opportunity to work with some of the pioneering surgeons. So that was exciting time in transplant because it was like this. It was opening up all these wonderful possibilities that today, are kind of almost taken for granted, or certainly have become commonplace in the 4 decades that have transpired since then. So one of the it was a struggle. We had some successes, but I tell you what, we had a lot of were spectacular failures, just bone crushing, horrible. Almost got there. It's always something. If you're doing something for the first time, you just couldn't possibly anticipate something, and something brand new you never thought of would come up and get you. It was tough, but on the other hand, boy, I had some amazing physicians as role models. I had some amazing role model physicians in my training at Emory and at Grady, but things were not universally accepted. There were a lot of kidney transplant surgeons in the United States who wouldn't invite Dr. Starzl to come to their city and recover a liver from their kidney donor. I've heard all these stories about, they all bleed to death. It's a bloodbath. I'm not risking my kidneys with any liver recovery. And so early on, it was difficult to get for Dr. Starzl to get enough livers, because there certainly weren't enough in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he was. So I was fortunate in Atlanta. We didn't have a kidney transplant surgeon to say no, and I was the one that was going to scrub with him anyway. So I had the sort of the honor, as it turns out, to scrub in surgery. Invited by Dr. Starzl, he and his first assistant would take the liver out, and I'd scrub with him to take the kidneys out. So he was an amazing surgeon to watch. Oh my goodness. And I consider myself a really top-notch first surgical assistant. And boy, I really had to be on the ball. But he was an incredible person and an incredible inspiration. I know for a whole generation of people, they don't call him the father of transplant for nothing. So I had all these wonderful opportunities that were all made possible by the altruism of donor families. We didn't ever do anything without a donor family consenting for those organs to be used. So we've come a long way, but it seemed like after, I know it wasn't a coincidence. From a historical standpoint, the National Organ Transplant Act was passed in 1984. Senator Al Gore was from Tennessee, and the organ bank that I worked with in Atlanta was part of the one in Tennessee. So I got a chance to work with Senator Gore and Jerry Mand on the National Organ Transplant Act. And so it passed, and it was the law that established the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network, and that contract was awarded to the United Network for Organ Sharing, and they have held that contract ever since. There's never been anybody beside them that had it. They basically were the Southeastern Organ Procurement Foundation. They did the kidney matching, and Gene Pierce, who was the head of that, just became the head of UNOS when it got the contract to be the OPTN based on NOTA. And one of the things that about NOTA was that it talked about how you couldn't discriminate in organ transplant and in organ allocation. And one of the issues that was mentioned, of course, was geography, that to the extent that utility would allow it, and utility balancing a desire to not discriminate geographically was modified by what they call utility, which was like how long you could preserve the organ. How long would it last? Would it do it any harm if you shipped it too far? Everything was very carefully looked at in that regard. And UNOS from the very outset believed, back then, of course, there wasn't a lot of advances in preservation yet. Most of it was just cold storage, simple hypothermic cold storage. not too long, 4 to 6 hours for hearts and lungs, and maybe a little bit longer for livers. But it was a rush, and so utility had to be balanced against geography. But geography was a tough one to get around because there were already organ banks in the country. About 160 of them at the time. And UNOS had a sort of a bedrock principles of what they call local primacy, or what I call local ownership, which means that the doctors and transplant programs in the area that it was recovered in, or within what they call the DSA, the donation service area, which basically defined the organ bank, that they got first shot at every organ. So, and that turned out to be an issue that once we got to where we could preserve the organs, and once we started asking hard questions about, well, if utility is not an issue, and we have a sicker patient across the George Washington Bridge at Columbia Presbyterian, but the donors in Fort Lee, then the people 5 minutes away don't have any shot at that organ because it's got to stay in New Jersey. Okay. And that was against the law. Basically, that was discriminating geographically when it didn't have to happen. So that local ownership is something that I have been sort of against my whole career, mainly because I talked to donor families for 30 years, and I never had a donor family that conditioned or said they preferred that the organ be used right there in their home state or their home city. They wanted a lot of things. They wanted the organ to do the most good, to last the longest, to go to the best person for it. But I never heard him say anything about keeping it local. So that's something that we're going to talk about, because that's in the process of changing. That's part of this accelerated advancement that I want to talk to you about, that's going on right now in the field. So that sort of stayed in place. Everything sort of just stagnated for a long time, decades, as a matter of fact. Not much seemed to happen. UNOS, they shared 6 antigen match kidneys, and they had a little wider sharing for emergency livers for a while, but it still was based on your DSA. And so that kind of stuck for a very long time, until patients got involved. The patients who were waiting on the organs got involved, because, I don't want to say skin in the game, dog in the fight. You know what I mean? Their lives were hanging in the balance. I think UNOS always assumed that anybody who wasn't insider, an internal stakeholder, not somebody with a transplant program, an organ bank, or a histocompatibility lab, that anybody else didn't need to be involved because they didn't understand it. It was too complicated for them, that kind of thing. But let me tell you, a lot of recipients did understand it, and understood it well enough that a family of a lady who was dying for needable lung transplant in New York City sued UNOS and sued the Department of Health and Human Services for this violation of the National Organ Transplant Act, saying, I can't get an organ that would become available 10 minutes away. That's geographic discrimination. And she won right away. So win number one for patients who were willing to advocate. Now, it's a shame it took a lawsuit, but that's what, in fact, it took, filed by a patient and filed by their family. So the power of one who starts it, and liver lawsuits like that followed after that, and a lot of people sort of became involved in looking at the system. And the folks that I met first that involved me in some real efforts at changing things, I met in about 2015, a gentleman by the name of Greg Siegel, who is from New York City. His co-founder at the time was Jennifer Arnold. More lately, Jennifer Erickson has been the person who's worked with him, and they are pretty much responsible for a lot of the legislation and a lot of the things that you've seen in Congress, and a lot of the reforms and restructuring and things that are going on out there right now. Greg was motivated by the fact that he's got a familial genetically inherited heart disease, that causes heart failure and you need a transplant. He sat with his father for about 5 years, waiting on his dad to get one. And unfortunately, his father did get one. He had an aunt, 2 aunts that didn't get one in time. And he's got family members, siblings who have the gene. So he has a reason to want to hold the system accountable and want it to work good. And if it could work better, he was very interested in that. Jennifer Erickson's father had renal failure, went on dialysis. He wasn't that old. He was a Vietnam veteran. And he, over a period of about 5 or 6 years, they had hoped that he would get a transplant, and he almost made it on the list a couple of times, but he just kept getting sicker with things wrong with him, and ultimately they told him that he couldn't be a candidate, and he passed away last year. He was buried at Arlington Cemetery. So Jennifer knows what it's like to watch your family member die, hoping that they could get a transplant, because I guess if there's one thing I've learned over my career in being able to talk to recipients, and I've been able to do that a lot more in the last 15 years than I'd say when I was at the organ bank, because I rarely met the recipients at the organ bank, only the donor families. But this sort of same sentiment that I've heard from a lot of folks that need an organ transplant is that they know it's going to be hard, and they know they're going to have to wait, but they would rather die trying than die waiting. Okay. And so we really have to look at ways that we can help more people not die waiting, because you know how bad of a problem that is. So patients started getting involved. Okay, I mean, patients have always been involved. UNOS had recipients positions on their board of directors of NOPTN, but it was usually one, maybe two. And I've talked to a lot of those people, and if you've been one of those, I don't mean to say any kind of disservice, but a lot of those people felt like they were token representation of recipient families, and a lot of us felt like that was window dressing. They didn't really seem to have a say. Nobody really took them seriously. They only a few times even had a donor family or a donor family member on the board. So there hadn't been widespread participation. But more recently, patients have gotten involved, and I think the more they've gotten involved, the more they've been able to accomplish, and the more they can still accomplish now. So Jennifer and Greg and I and a multitude of other people in the transplant field have worked hard to fund the science, get the data, and start convincing people that we needed to make some changes in the system. And that was not easy. I have learned a lot, and perhaps you can learn some of it too. It didn't do any good to go to UNOS. Okay, that was clear. And in fact, if you went to UNOS and you stirred the pot too much and you made too many waves, then you basically got blacklisted. I mean, I sort of got blacklisted back in '88. But there were retaliations and recriminations, and they didn't have the kind of transparency or the corporate culture. And again, these are not transplant centers and transplant surgeons per se. These are executives and business people that run UNOS. We had all these people get involved, and so we educated a lot of people, but we had to go through a process of convincing a lot of people that the things that we were asking for, suggesting needed to be changed and looked at, were based on science, and were based on transplant professionals coming forward and being willing to stand up when they knew they were going to get in trouble for it, and speak to the two groups that we found were most important. And we did that by finding out that the most well-respected investigative media outlets in the United States, Washington Post, New York Times, Kaiser Health News, there's a lot of them that are willing to do investigative stories to point out problems and to try to bring those into the light, to try to do something about it. And let me tell you, they are hard people to convince. They vetted us up and down every way you can imagine to prove that what we were saying was true, from the science to the people who testified, to the people who were willing to go on the record. They checked it every which way. And then they published the stories. And they began to get a lot of attention because they were critical of the system, not of individual transplant programs per se, but sort of the system as a whole. And they were pretty critical, and that started getting attention. So that sort of grew. And once the press expresses those things and the public gets involved, and the public is the one that they're doing this on the behalf, then Congress got involved and gets involved, because they're listening a lot more than you think they are. That was the second thing that we learned, was that getting through the investigative press was very difficult. Getting through congressional investigative committees was even worse than that, and getting through CMS was tough. And so, but we had the data, we had the experts, but mostly we had the patients, and they always said that that's who they like to listen to the most, because they're the client, they're the end user. It's their getting a transplant, and I could vouch that I thought that, donor families and recipients and transplant donor families and recipients and their families, frontline organ workers didn't have any say, really weren't at the table, so to speak. And that was just, I don't know. There were not going to be any transplant coordinators on the UNOS board when that organization first came into being. And yet they demanded that we turn over our 24 alert organ matching system to them. Turn it over to us. We're the OPTN. We said, whoa. So we've actually traded that organ matching system for 2 spots on the board. And, it's taken this long to have transplant coordinators who ultimately became, presidents of UNOS. There have been 3 now, including current one. So there's a lot of work that's been going on, both with CMS, with the press, with Congress. If you've seen any of the investigative committee hearings, you can see, Congress is serious about trying to improve the system, because, it's not like we haven't been talking about the need for organs and the shortage of organs for about 4 decades now. And most people agree that it just hasn't really improved at a rate that would keep up with the number of transplant recipients that are added and the number we expect to do. So I can't tell you how important recipients have been, from the testimony before Congress to being interviewed by the press, to acting on the Patient Affairs Committee of the OPTN. I have talked to some of those people, and they have been fearless, and have somewhat paid the price, but they called the shots like they see them, and they felt like recipients needed more voice, and Congress listened, and CMS listened. Everybody's listening to them. So don't think that if you respond with comments to an RFI from CMS, if there's an open, there's all kinds of ways. In fact, I sent Jen one recently. HRSA's got this organ donation. Can't remember what all the initials stand for, but it's now that we have the CMS final rule, almost final. Now that we have passed the securing the U.S. Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, that legislation that we just passed. In fact, it passed, interestingly enough, that started with the Obama administration. That was when I first got involved with a group called Organize, that is a patient advocacy group that Greg Siegel started. And they helped organize the first White House summit on organ donation and transplantation in 2016 with President Obama. So a lot of these things that we started off, we expected them to, continue right away and continue to build upon themselves in the expected Clinton administration that was supposed to follow Obama. So we all know how that worked out. But I think the assumption was that nothing would happen because the tendency had been for in these polarized times, the president didn't want to have anything to do with the previous president's things, and the next president didn't want to have anything to do with his, and yet we have been able to quietly make this reform movement and these improvement movements across three presidents, Obama, Trump, and Joe Biden. Especially, I mean, Trump was behind some of the bigger legislation or bigger moves. So they have all done that. And when we got our bill to Congress, it passed 635 votes to 0. Now, in these times, folks, that kind of bicameral and bipartisan support signed, and no absent, nothing. Every last one of them signed it, and so it hasn't got to Biden's desk yet. It will in the fullness of time, I hope, and he's expected to sign it. So that's going to accomplish something that we have been working very hard to do, and have been putting the science and the effort into improving the OPTN. And so now, with that bill becoming law, it will be possible for the first time for the OPTN bid to be opened up to organizations other than UNOS. I mean, they've been the only one who could bid because you always had to have 3 years of experience being the OPTN to bid. So now the law says that will be open to other groups and contractors. They've taken the ceiling off the budget for that. So that's going to bring about a lot of change as well. So you see that being talked about with HRSA and CMS. They're already planning all these things, and a lot of them, a lot of the recommendations and things came from the NASM committee report. You heard of this thing, what does it say? Realizing the promise of equity in organ transplantation. I was very honored to be invited to sit on this committee and work on this report, and it really didn't pull any punches either. The system was not working well, and it was certainly not working in the benefit of people of color or people didn't have the financial means or those kinds of things. And so we made a lot of recommendations in that report. I think if you haven't had a chance to see it, I know it's 300-something pages long, but you can actually download a PDF copy off the internet. And maybe if you just scan some of the recommendations and the summaries and the recommendations, we have laid out, a pretty bold plan for things. And I'm glad to say that a lot of that has already been adopted by Congress and by the federal government. So I think it will take effect. So it has opened up this period where there's going to be rapid change in the system. Okay, we really don't have to change the transplant centers. They're doing great. You should have great faith in your transplant centers. And we've got a problem with some of the OPOs, and we're going to fix that because everything that happens in this industry is downstream from the supply of organs. Okay, the equity issues, the accessibility, all of those things are under nobody's control except the people who control the number of organs that come into the system, and that's the organ banks. So we're working on those folks too, but it's been really rewarding for me to see recipients listen to, and I mean, you write a public comment to CMS, they'll answer it and publish it, and a lot of those things become a matter of public record. So I can tell you that you won't be ignored. In fact, you will probably be given more weight than the rest of us will. So and the NASM report said that if there was ever going to be any solutions to us fixing the system, the OPTN and UNOS was going to have to start considering and including external stakeholders and organizations and patient advocacy groups and people to be at the table and to have a voice and to have some say so in what's going to go on. So I think that's all on the horizon, and all of those agencies and organizations are soliciting feedback and stories, your experiences, the things that you want to see changed, and it's going across the whole spectrum of reimbursement for blood tests for rejection to living donation assistance and all of the kinds of things that are going on right now. So we're in a period of accelerated change, and I'm excited because I was in one long ago, and we were able to marshal folks and get a job done. And I think there's a real opportunity that hasn't existed perhaps up until the last little bit for patients to really make a difference. So I know Jen and I have talked about that, and there are currently ways that you can do that. We certainly had patients involved in the NASM committee in testimony and seeking their input. So almost everybody out there, and hopefully soon UNOS will be ready to be seriously interested in what recipients have to say, and waiting recipients, families, and donors and their families, because without those, we wouldn't do transplants if we didn't have recipients, and we can't do them without donors. So it's not rocket science, folks. You have to fund the right people. We have to have. There's a horrible shortage of frontline organ bank personnel right now because it's such a hard job. It grinds through people in 2.5 years on average. Okay. We ground through so many professionals in several decades that we hardly can get a nurse to apply for that job anymore. There's still some OPOs that require that. And I grew up and trained in practice in a time where I required that. Because we took it seriously. It was a hard job. Managing brain dead patients is difficult, and evaluating all these different organ systems and matching them to the specific needs of all these different recipients who have different diseases and all kinds of different requirements and demands is a medical challenge. It takes competent clinicians to do it. So there's all kinds of ways that we can try to improve the system, but we have signed up now over half the population of the country on donor registries. And I can tell you, for the first 30 years when I was talking to donor families, we didn't have them out in a registry back then. You had to get the consent from every one of those families. And so it gave me an opportunity to learn how they really felt, what they really hoped for, what they were going through. I'm glad to say that a couple of decades into my career, I got very involved in trying to change the prohibition that had stood forever, that forbid any contact between an organ recipient and their donor family. Absolutely forbidden before the early 1990s. And we had some cases where the families knew each other. Chet Zuber certainly knew his donor and his family, and a lot of the first transplants that got publicity and attention, people put it together because basically there was this, the donation was altruistic. It was voluntary, and you're asked to give up a part of your child or your spouse to a perfect stranger. So that's a charitable altruistic event, and it's sacred in our Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, and so it's amazing to give that gift. So the recipients, we know, are grateful. We also know that they'd like to say thank you. Okay. We also know that donor families, because we started doing bereavement aftercare and taking care of them after the donation, instead of just sending them a letter at 2 weeks, telling them a little bit about the recipient, we started really providing bereavement aftercare and those kinds of things. And we started listening to them. And we found out that there was this incomplete gift circle that couldn't complete itself because there was no contact between the donor families and the recipients. And I think everybody was concerned about how that might go, but we worked very hard for a number of years and have turned that into a regular thing that is done. And of course, it had to be done very carefully. It has to be only done with the consent of both parties, and it's brokered through the transplant center and the organ bank, and it's very carefully controlled. Still doesn't work as good as it should everywhere. And some of you as recipients may have thought about thanking your donor family, or may have hadn't even had those opportunities. And maybe some of you have had that opportunity and some haven't. But it's amazing since we did that, and since you think about when you look at popular media right now, think about how many times they have a news clip or a story about a donor family or a donor mom listening to the heart of her child. And I had been trying to say all along, we've got to educate the public. They barely know about kidney donation. We've got to make them want to donate their hearts and their livers and their lungs and all those things. And so we have to educate them. So we started off, on a tight budget. We started off, I think, by a lot of recipients, of course, wanted to promote organ donation. So we had those. We used sports figures for a while. We went through a number of things, but I think until we started using donor families, who are the ones that give the organs, then we didn't start seeing these huge increases in registrations for people to be organ donors, which we've seen. So hopefully that will continue to rise, but it's a carefully protected circle. Transplant recipients are counting on it, and organ banks, there are a lot of them that do a great job, and everybody who works in an organ bank is dedicated. You just won't believe how dedicated they are, and that's why it's so hard to see them used up in 2.5 years. It really has been. That's been the hardest part of my career, and since I'm the last Mohican and I'm the only one that's ever survived this long, as you can imagine, I've seen most of my colleagues gone. So, and boy, if we had them back, if we just had some of those experienced people back, but they're out there and they're working every night, and we ought to support them. So because we can get great outcomes. We can do amazing things. We can get transplants for people that last a very long time and change their lives. So I think that's a good segue for me to tell my closing story. There they are. Show you a few pictures. One of the cases that I did back in the 80s, it was one of those cases where they were doing the first ones, and so the donor had to go to the recipient. We had invented this organ sharing system that was used by the transplant centers and the OPOs to match organs, and we were matching hearts and livers and lungs. And so the very first time, well, let me go back just a little bit to how many of you remember from 1984 the first xenotransplant, where they transplanted the baby baboon's heart into baby Faye? Folks remember that? Well, that was an amazing thing. That happened the year that Enos started out with Leonard Bailey in California. Boy, that caught the world's attention. She only lived for a couple of weeks, and they just got such bad publicity from that. They really endured a lot of problems, and I guess some of it had to do with animal rights and the fact that baboons and those animals are sort of close enough to being sentient. You noticed when they did this pig transplant, nobody complained about that, right? So that's an emotional kind of thing, but at any rate, baby face heart transplant didn't work. They had hoped newborn babies have sort of this immunological window of privilege before their immune system really begins to develop right when they're first born, and so they were hoping the child might be a little bit more able to accept the antigens and the from the baboon heart. The heart was the right size, and you had to have a heart the size of a walnut for a newborn heart transplant. And so Leonard Bailey, God bless him, God rest his soul, took that risk, learned from that. They got some criticism because they didn't try to use a human donor. Well, there had never been a newborn heart donor before. Nobody even thought such a thing was possible. But it was, and a donor family the next year in '85 had a child who had a brain injury, a anoxic injury during birth, and was in a NICU up at Stanford, and it was brain dead. And it took 10 days to pronounce brain dead in a newborn back then. 10 days of observation without the condition changing. And they volunteered their baby because they had heard about baby Faye and said, well, could our baby be a heart donor? And Loma Linda had just sent a little boy home to die and called him back in. And sure enough, they flew that baby down to Loma Linda, and baby Moses, they didn't use names anymore because they learned how to deal with the press. But baby Moses was the first newborn infant male transplanted. And he's still alive, by the way. He's almost 38 years old, and he has had his same heart. He lives in California, and he's a fun guy, and lives life large because of that donor family, and because of Leonard Bailey doing the first human heart transplant in history on him. So the next year they had some patients who died waiting, and then they heard about this matching system. So they listed a newborn baby girl. I think she was 16 days old at the time. She was terminally going to die because all these babies had hypoplastic left heart syndrome, meaning the left side of their heart didn't develop. So they were doomed as soon as they came off their mother's circulation. They weren't going to live because the heart just wasn't going to do anything. So it's funny. There's a quote from Dr. Bailey that I don't know if I can find it. Yeah, there's a quote from Dr. Bailey. I'm going to have to read it. So if it looks like I'm not looking at you, it's because I'm reading this. Dr. Bailey said, before he died, obviously, few life events on earth exceed the realization of love, the miracle of conception, or the emotion of birthing. Babies are naturally embraced by hope, by reflection of what can be, and by promises to keep. That is, unless the heart within the baby's breast is so poorly developed that life cannot go on. I have been driven by the notion that heart disease would not end the promise of a newborn infant. Heart transplantation restores the hopes and dreams surrounding these babies, and hence ranks right up there with the best of life events on earth. It's a genuine rebirthing for a baby dying of heart disease, and the process is a very fine moment indeed for humanity. It's fundamentally good news, and while it may not necessarily even the score for all the tragedy facing our planet, saving a baby always makes a clear statement for what can and ought to be in the universe. As with the babies and their loved ones, my own life assumes new meaning and affirmation in the process. He says, I am compelled by the belief that saving babies is the right thing to do. So he persevered, and he did baby Moses, and baby Moses did fine. So they had a little girl that they tried listing on the new matching system. I was on call that night in 1986, got a call from a neonatal ICU unit in Atlanta. They had a 9-day-old baby who had been born and got the cord wrapped around its neck, and it cut off the blood supply of its brain, and had an anoxic brain injury and was brain dead. Sweet young parents, African-American, first child, almost like late teenagers. They weren't very old. Of course, devastated. So that was the potential that they called me to see. So, I've looked at the chart and examined the baby, and, realized that, well, the only thing that we can recover, as far as I know, from this size or an age of an infant is the heart. And so I'm going to check. I told the neonatologist I'd check on this national a waiting list to see if there was any possibility that there was any baby that would show up that matched this baby's blood type, and we knew that the size would be right. So I checked it in, and there wasn't anything there. So I said I was sorry, but she said, well, today's day 9, tomorrow is day 10. And I'm going to do the official pronouncement tomorrow. And I said, oh, well, then let me come back by tomorrow. We'll look again. Just, you never know. And sure enough, I came back and looked the next day, and there was the baby at Loma Linda. It came up as a match for my donor, who they ended up calling Baby Eve, because she was the first female newborn heart donor. So this sweet family was nice enough to donate their baby's heart. And even nicer to allow me to take their baby from that ICU out to Loma Linda, California, where Dr. Bailey successfully transplanted little Eric's heart into Baby Eve. So she was number 2, first female, and she was 16 days old. I met her in the operating room because I had to go out there and I had to take the donor. So I got to watch the transplant, and Dr. Bailey's wife took care of me. She was so nice. I was so tired. I was in a coma, and watched him do that transplant of that walnut-sized heart. It was a pretty amazing experience. And she did fine, just like baby Moses. It did fine, and went home not too long after that. And I, went on to my next case. Because there'd been a press blackout. They had not allowed any press on this case, on either of those cases, for reasons. But I did get to see her again later, when I sponsored, or the organization that I was with, the Order of St. Lazarus, sponsored her to ride on the Donate Life float in the Rose Parade a number of years ago, and that was an amazing thing to see. She had her first child by then, Daniel, and he was there, and her husband was there, and we really had a great time. What I didn't know at the time, but we found out later, is that we didn't really sponsor one rider on the Donate Life float. We sponsored 3, pregnant with twins, when she rode the float. So, she grew up. She did have to be retransplanted once, but was able to grow up and was able to do. Here's something that she said that I'd like to read to you, because it struck home with me. Baby Eve, whose real name is Layla, by the way. She wrote, 6 years ago, just a few months before I became pregnant with the twins, I said this: I may not have a career, but I'm a mother and a wife. And that's the only thing I've ever truly wanted out of life. It is the hardest thing I've ever faced in my life. There have been many struggles along the way, and I'm sure there are many more to come. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I may feel a little overwhelmed at times, but they all have taught me so much. They complete me. And when the day comes that I leave this world, I will die a happy woman, knowing that I left a mark on this world, that I accomplished the one thing I've wanted out of life, and that is my children, my boys, my husband, and my family. So let me show you Baby Eve and her family. The twins, Danielle, and they live in California. So, 37 years of survival. So all of those things are possible with every transplant recipient. And some of you will go maybe your whole lives with one organ. Some of you may need another transplant, but that's why you should all be advocates if you can. Or if you want to, because you have something at stake, and we can make the system better. And granted, I think artificial organs and xenotransplants and those kinds of things are surely coming, and we will look forward to that day. But it's been a unique time in the history of man that that allowed organ donation and organ transplant to be done in this country voluntarily. So I would urge you, Jen can help you. I can help you. There are a lot of people that can direct you to ways that your voice and your concerns and your hopes and desires can be listened to by the people who are in the process of redesigning the new system now, the new OPTN. So don't hesitate to reach out, and don't think that you can't make a difference because you can make a difference. And thank you for having me. It's been fun. If we have time, I talked right at an hour, it looks like, but I'd be happy to answer questions or let Jen take back over.
Charles, thank you so much. I don't know about you guys, but this was absolutely incredible. So moving, so absolutely touching. My heart is absolutely full, warm, fuzzy, empowered, inspirational. I mean, you name it, I felt it tonight. Again, and interacting with you, I'm so glad we were able to host you tonight. I mean, absolutely, truly moving. I don't know, I'm sure you guys have comments, questions for Charles. So maybe if we can just start, for those of you that want to stick around, I'm sure you guys absolutely do, but if we can go around really quickly, you guys kind of know my drill. I'll stop recording, but I know Charles was kind of interested to hear a little bit of your stories, your own personal stories, where you guys are from, what organ's been transplanted, and what transplant center, because we've got a great group of individuals here tonight. Just kind of, guys, just the typical elevator pitch. I'll stop recording and then I'll just call on people. So Steve, if you want to start, because you're just next to me at the top of the list, go ahead and just unmute yourselves, guys, and I'll call on you and we can go from there.
Okay, I'm Steve Whiteson. I'm a heart transplant recipient from 2019.